I saw him rise from the river like a ghost returning from the dead, and in that moment, everything I believed about my life shattered into 1,000 silent pieces. The mark on his chest was not a scar, not a wound, but a birthright that should have been buried with the Blackwood dynasty 20 years ago. I am Honoria Ashworth, Duchess of Thornfield, and I will tell you now the story of how I fell in love with a man who did not exist, how I nearly destroyed myself to save him, and how, in the end, we found our way to a truth that neither of us had dared to imagine. But I must begin where all such stories begin, in the quiet before the storm, in the days when I still believed that loneliness was simply the price one paid for a title. I married Cornelius Ashworth, the Duke of Thornfield, in the spring of my 19th year. It was not a love match. My father, Baron Whitmore of Ashbury, had debts that threatened to swallow our family whole, and Cornelius had need of a wife who would not ask questions, who would manage his household with grace, and who would understand that his heart belonged to London, to politics, to ambitions I could never share. I was young enough to hope that affection might grow, that the cold formality of our wedding night might warm into something resembling tenderness. I was wrong. I remember the day of my wedding with a clarity that surprises me still. The church was cold despite the spring sunshine, and I shivered in my white silk gown as I walked down the aisle toward a man I had met only 3 times before. Cornelius stood at the altar with the expression of a man conducting a business transaction, which, in truth, he was. I was the commodity being exchanged, my youth and breeding traded for the financial salvation of my family. My mother wept as she watched me take my vows. I thought then that she wept from joy, but now I know better. She wept because she knew what awaited me, the long years of lonely duty, the slow erosion of hope, the quiet death of every romantic dream I had ever harbored. She had lived the same life, married to a man who valued her only for what she could provide, and she recognized the same fate descending upon her daughter. The wedding breakfast was a lavish affair, attended by half the nobility of England. I smiled and accepted congratulations and pretended that I was not terrified. Cornelius sat beside me, occasionally patting my hand in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, but felt merely perfunctory. He spoke little to me and much to his political associates, and by the time we departed for Thornfield, I had begun to understand the shape of my new life. The first year of my marriage taught me the geography of silence. Thornfield Manor was a vast estate in the countryside of Derbyshire, a sprawling monument to generations of Ashworth wealth. Its halls were lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch my every movement with disapproval. Its gardens stretched for miles, a labyrinth of hedges and fountains and carefully pruned roses that bloomed in defiant beauty each summer. And its master, my husband, visited perhaps 4 times a year, staying just long enough to remind me of my duties before returning to his life in the city. The house itself was a magnificent prison, 4 stories of gray stone, with towers at each corner and windows that looked out upon grounds so vast I could walk for hours without reaching their boundary. The interior was decorated in the heavy style of the previous century, all dark woods and velvet drapes and furniture that had witnessed generations of Ashworth brides come and go. I wondered sometimes what had become of those women, whether they had found happiness within these walls or whether they had slowly withered like cut flowers, their beauty fading in the perpetual twilight of unused rooms. My apartments were in the east wing, far from the chambers where Cornelius slept when he deigned to visit. The distance was symbolic, I understood, a physical manifestation of the emotional gulf that stretched between us. On the rare occasions when he came to my bed, he did so with the air of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary duty, and afterward he returned to his own rooms without a word. I lay alone in the darkness, staring at the canopy above my head, and tried to remember why I had ever believed that this could become something more. The servants treated me with respect, but not warmth. They had served the Ashworth family for generations, and I was merely the latest in a long line of duchesses who had come to Thornfield with bright hopes and slowly learned to lower their expectations. Mrs. Bramwell, the housekeeper, was efficient and correct in all things, but she rarely smiled, and when she looked at me, I sensed a kind of weary pity that cut deeper than any cruelty could have done. Mr. Enderby, the butler, was ancient and imperious, speaking to me as if I were a particularly slow child who needed everything explained in simple terms. The maids and footmen went about their duties with mechanical precision, and none of them seemed to see me as anything other than an obstacle to be navigated. I learned to fill my days with the small rituals of a duchess. I wrote letters to my mother and my younger sister, Philippa, though I was careful never to reveal the depth of my unhappiness. I supervised the household staff with what I hoped was competence. I walked the gardens in the early morning, when the dew still clung to the petals, and the world felt, for a few precious hours, like it belonged to me alone. I read voraciously, working my way through the extensive library that no one else seemed to use, losing myself in novels and poetry and histories of distant lands. And I waited, always waiting, for something to change, for some crack to appear in the monotony of my existence through which light might enter. It was on one of those walks, in the autumn of my 3rd year at Thornfield, that I first noticed him. He was kneeling in the rose garden, his hands buried in the dark earth, his back bent to a task I could not quite discern. I had seen gardeners before, of course. Thornfield employed a small army of them, men who trimmed hedges and planted bulbs and kept the grounds in a state of perpetual perfection. But this man was different. There was something in the way he moved, a deliberateness, a quiet intensity that made me pause at the edge of the gravel path. He worked with the focus of someone who found meaning in the task, not merely performing a job, but engaging in something that mattered to him. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but there was also a tenderness in the way he handled the roses, a care that seemed at odds with the calloused fingers and rough-hewn appearance of a common laborer. I found myself transfixed, watching him as one might watch a painter at work, sensing that I was witnessing something more than mere gardening. He looked up as if sensing my presence, and for a moment our eyes met. He had dark hair, long enough to curl at the collar of his worn linen shirt, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was angular, weathered by sun and wind, but beneath the roughness there was a refinement I could not explain. A straight nose, high cheekbones, a jaw that spoke of stubbornness and strength. He was perhaps 30 years of age, though something in his gaze made him seem older, as if he carried the weight of more years than his body had lived. There was sorrow in those eyes, I realized, a deep and abiding sorrow that he had learned to conceal but could not quite extinguish. He inclined his head in a gesture that was almost, but not quite, a bow. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was low, cultured, entirely wrong for a man who spent his days with soil beneath his fingernails. The words were correct, the deference appropriate, but there was something in his tone, a hint of irony perhaps, or simply the echo of a different life, that made me catch my breath. I did not know what to say. I nodded in return and continued on my walk, but I found myself glancing back, watching as he returned to his work with the same quiet focus. There was a grace in his movements that belied his station, a fluid economy of motion that suggested training far more refined than any gardener would possess. I thought of the fencing masters who had instructed my cousins, of the dancing teachers who had drilled deportment into young gentlemen of quality, and I wondered what strange fate had brought such a man to dig in the dirt at Thornfield. That night, I asked Mrs. Bramwell, the housekeeper, about the new gardener. "That would be Gideon, Your Grace," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He came to us about 2 years past, just before your arrival. A quiet sort, keeps to himself. Lives in the old groundskeeper's cottage by the East Woods." "Has he references?" I asked, and I did not know why the question felt so urgent. none that he offered and none that Mr. Ashworth required. He works hard and asks for little. We have had no cause to question him. I should have let the matter rest. I should have returned to my embroidery, my letters, my carefully constructed routine of dignified solitude. But something had shifted in me that morning, some small crack in the wall I had built around my heart, and I found that I could not stop thinking about the gardener with the storm cloud eyes. Over the months that followed, I watched him. Not openly, not in any way that could be remarked upon, but with the careful attention of a woman who had little else to occupy her mind. I noticed that he worked longer hours than any of the other gardeners, often remaining in the grounds until the light had faded entirely. I noticed that he spoke rarely to the other servants, and when he did, it was with a formality that seemed at odds with his station. I noticed that he carried a book in the pocket of his coat, a small leather volume that he read during his brief rests, and once, when I passed close enough to see, I caught a glimpse of Latin text on its yellowed pages. These were not the habits of a common laborer. These were the habits of a man who had once been something else entirely. I told myself that my interest was merely curiosity, the idle speculation of a bored duchess with too much time on her hands. But I knew even then that I was lying to myself. There was a pull between us, something I could not name, and each time our paths crossed in the garden, I felt it grow stronger. He never spoke to me beyond the required courtesies. "Good morning, Your Grace. Fine weather today, Your Grace. The roses will bloom early this year, Your Grace." His voice was always respectful, his eyes always averted, his manner always correct. And yet, sometimes, I caught him watching me from a distance, his expression unreadable, and in those moments, I felt more seen than I had in years. The winter of my 4th year at Thornfield was particularly harsh. Snow blanketed the grounds from December through February, and the house grew cold despite the fires that burned constantly in every hearth. The wind howled through the corridors at night, rattling the windows and moaning in the chimneys, and I lay in my bed with blankets piled high, listening to the sounds of a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Cornelius did not come for Christmas. He sent a letter explaining that parliamentary business detained him, along with a pair of pearl earrings that I knew his secretary had chosen. The letter was brief and impersonal. A few lines dashed off between more pressing matters, and I read it once, and then burned it in the fire. The earrings were beautiful, perfectly matched pearls set in gold, but when I wore them to the servants' dinner on Christmas Eve, I felt their weight like a rebuke. They were a husband's obligation, not a husband's love, and they reminded me of everything my marriage lacked. The servants' dinner was a tradition at Thornfield, a night when the rigid hierarchies that governed our household were briefly relaxed. I sat at the head of the table and distributed the traditional gifts of coins and new gloves, smiling as each servant came forward to receive their portion. Mrs. Bramwell thanked me with her usual reserve. Mr. Enderby bowed with creaking formality. The maids curtsied, and the footman nodded, and I played the part of the gracious Duchess with practiced ease. But I could not help noticing that one face was absent from the gathering. Gideon, the gardener, had not joined the household celebration. I asked Mrs. Bramwell about it afterward, as casually as I could manage. "He prefers his solitude, Your Grace," she said. "He has always taken his meals in the cottage. We bring him provisions, but he keeps to himself." I nodded and said nothing more, but that night, as the snow fell silently outside my window, I found myself thinking of a man alone in a stone cottage at the edge of the woods, with no one to share his Christmas, no one to break the silence of the longest night of the year. It was during that winter that I began to walk past the groundskeeper's cottage on my morning rounds. I told myself that I was simply varying my route, that the path through the east woods offered shelter from the wind, that there was nothing unusual about a duchess taking an interest in the farthest reaches of her own estate. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I wanted to see him. The cottage was a small stone building, half hidden by ancient oaks, with smoke curling from its chimney and a neat stack of firewood beside the door. The roof was thatched and slightly sagging, the windows small and deep-set, the whole structure seeming to have grown from the earth itself rather than being built upon it. It was the kind of place where a hermit might live, or a wise woman from a fairy tale, and there was something both comforting and mysterious about its presence in the winter landscape. Sometimes I saw him through the window, bent over a table where books and papers were spread in careful piles. He would be reading or writing, his face lit by candlelight even in the middle of the day, lost in a world that I could only imagine. Sometimes I heard music, the low, mournful notes of a violin, played with a skill that no gardener should possess. The melodies were complex and beautiful, full of longing and loss, and I would stand among the trees and listen until my fingers grew numb with cold. I never stopped. I never knocked. I simply walked past, my heart racing beneath the layers of wool and fur that protected me from the cold, and wondered what secrets lived inside those walls. I wondered what he thought about, what he dreamed of, what had brought him to this remote corner of the world to live among roses and silence. And I wondered, with a longing that frightened me, what it would feel like to sit beside him in that cottage, to share his fire and his music and his secrets. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived with a vengeance. The gardens erupted into bloom, and I found myself spending more and more time among the flowers, always with a book in hand, always with an excuse prepared should anyone ask why the Duchess of Thornfield seemed so fascinated by horticulture. In truth, I was fascinated by only one thing, and he was currently pruning the wisteria that climbed the south wall of the conservatory. It was on a morning in late April that everything changed. I had risen early, unable to sleep, and decided to walk beyond the formal gardens into the wilder grounds that bordered the river. The water was high from the spring rains, rushing over rocks with a sound that drowned out everything else. I followed the bank for perhaps half a mile, my skirts growing damp from the wet grass, my mind wandering through the familiar corridors of my discontent. And then I saw him. He was standing in the shallows of the river, his back to me, water streaming down the bare skin of his shoulders and spine. He had been bathing, I realized, in the cold, rushing current, and he had not heard my approach over the roar of the water. The morning light caught the droplets on his skin, turning them to diamonds, and for a moment I could only stare at the beauty of him, at the lean strength of his body, at the way he stood, with his face tilted toward the sun, as if drawing warmth from its rays. I should have turned away. I should have retreated silently, preserved his dignity and my own. A proper lady would have fled, would have pretended she had never seen this intimate moment, would have locked the image away in the deepest recesses of her mind and never spoken of it to anyone. But I could not move. My feet seemed rooted to the earth, my breath caught in my throat, and I could only watch as he stood there in the rushing water, unaware of my presence. He turned, reaching for the shirt he had left on a nearby rock, and I saw his chest. The mark was unmistakable. A crest, raised and reddened against his skin, the size of a man's palm, directly over his heart. It was not a scar, not a brand inflicted as punishment, but a birthmark, nature's own stamp of identity upon his flesh. I had seen that crest before, in history books, in paintings, in the grand hall of my father's house, where a tapestry commemorated the great families of England. It was the Blackwood crest, the crowned lion rampant upon a field of stars, the symbol of the royal line that had been extinguished in blood and fire during the Succession War of 1762. I gasped, and the sound carried across the water. He spun toward me, his eyes wide with a fear I had never seen in him before. His whole body tensed, coiled like a spring about to release, and for a moment I thought he might run. I thought he might plunge into the river and swim for the far bank, disappearing into the wilderness beyond, never to be seen again. But instead, he stood frozen, his shirt clutched in his hands, his face a mask of terror and resignation. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The river rushed between us, cold and indifferent, and I saw in his face the terrible truth of what I had discovered. This was not merely a gardener with an unusual birthmark. This was a man who had been hunted for 2 decades, whose very existence was a threat to powerful men, whose discovery would mean certain death. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was no longer that of a gardener. It was the voice of a man who had been running for 20 years and had finally, inevitably, been caught. There was nobility in that voice, breeding and education and all the things that could never be taught, only inherited. There was also a weariness so profound that it made my heart ache. I did not know what to say. My mind was reeling, sorting through fragments of memory and rumor, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The Blackwood massacre had happened when I was a young girl, barely old enough to understand. I remembered my father speaking of it in hushed tones, remembered the shock that rippled through society when news arrived that the entire royal family had been slaughtered in a single night. King Aldrich, Queen Marguerite, their 3 daughters, and their only son, Prince Ambrose, 18 years old and said to be the most promising heir the Blackwoods had ever produced. My mother had wept when she heard the news. She had known Queen Marguerite slightly, had been presented at court as a young woman, and had always spoken of the Queen with admiration. "The king is dead," she had said, her face pale with shock. "The whole family, even the children. What kind of monsters would do such a thing?" The monsters, I had later learned, were men who called themselves patriots, who claimed that the Blackwood dynasty had grown corrupt and tyrannical, who believed that England would be better served by a new order. The Earl of Hexworth had led the conspiracy, gathering around him a coalition of nobles and generals who shared his ambitions. They had struck on a winter night when the palace was poorly defended and the royal family gathered for a private celebration. By morning, the Blackwood era had ended in blood. The official account held that there were no survivors. The new regime, led by the Earl of Hexworth and his allies, had consolidated power swiftly, and within a year, the Blackwoods were nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to those who clung too tightly to the old ways. There had been rumors, of course, whispers of a prince who had escaped, of a young man seen fleeing into the night. But the years had passed with no sign of him, and eventually the rumors had faded into legend. But the man standing before me, water still dripping from his dark hair, bore the proof of a different story on his chest. The Blackwood crest, the mark that every heir to the throne had carried since the dynasty began, was etched into his skin like a signature from fate. "You are," I began, and found I could not finish the sentence. He crossed the shallows in 3 long strides, reaching me before I could step back, before I could think to scream. But he did not touch me. He simply stood there, close enough that I could see the rapid pulse in his throat, close enough that I could smell the clean scent of river water on his skin. "Please," he said, and his voice broke on the word. "Please, Your Grace. If you ever felt any kindness toward me, any compassion at all, you will forget what you have seen." I looked into his eyes, those storm cloud eyes that had haunted my thoughts for over a year, and I saw not a gardener, not a fugitive, but a man who had lost everything and was terrified of losing the little he had left. "I will not betray you," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. He searched my face, looking for the lie, and when he did not find it, something in him seemed to collapse. He turned away from me, his shoulders bowing under a weight I could not imagine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "My name," he said at last, "is Ambrose. Ambrose Blackwood. I am the last of my line, and I have been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. I listened as he told me everything, how he had escaped the massacre through a secret passage known only to the royal family, a tunnel that led from his chambers to a cave beyond the palace walls. He had been woken by screams in the night, by the clash of steel and the smell of smoke, and he had known immediately that something terrible was happening. His father had shown him the passage years before, had made him memorize its twists and turns, had told him that if the worst should ever come, he must run and never look back. And so he had run. He had fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on his back and the mark on his chest that would condemn him if ever discovered. He had not stopped to find his parents, his sisters, the people he loved most in the world. He had simply run, driven by an instinct for survival that felt, even now, like the deepest betrayal. I was a coward, he said, and his voice broke on the word. I left them to die. I saved myself while they were being murdered in their beds. You were 18 years old, I said. What could you have done? I could have died with them. I could have faced their killers like a man. Instead, I hid in a cave until dawn, listening to the distant sounds of slaughter, and then I walked away from everything I had ever known. He told me of the years that followed, the endless wandering, the constant fear. He had traveled through England, then to France, then to the Low Countries, always moving, always looking over his shoulder. He had worked as a stable hand, a tutor, a clerk in a merchant's counting house. He had learned to speak French without an accent, to dress like a commoner, to make himself invisible in a crowd. And all the while, he had known that there were men searching for him, men who would stop at nothing to ensure that the last Blackwood heir never lived to claim his birthright. There is a price on my head, he said. £10,000 for the man who delivers me, dead or alive, to the Earl of Hexworth. I have seen the notices, nailed to tavern doors and church gates across the continent. My face has aged beyond recognition, but the mark on my chest never changes. It is my death warrant, written on my own skin. Why did you come back to England? I asked. Surely you were safer abroad. He smiled, a bitter smile that held no joy. I was tired, he said. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being alone. I thought that if I found a remote enough place, a household that asked no questions, I might be able to rest, to live out whatever years remained to me in peace. How he had come to Thornfield 2 years ago, drawn by the remoteness of the estate and the reputation of its master for caring little about the affairs of his household. He had presented himself as a common laborer, a man without history or connections, willing to work hard for little pay. Mr. Enderby had barely glanced at him before sending him to join the gardening staff, and Mrs. Bramwell had assigned him the old cottage without a second thought. I have been careful, he said. I have spoken to no one, trusted no one. I thought I could live out my days here, forgotten by the world, at peace with my ghosts. I thought the search had ended, that the hunters had given up. And now I have ruined everything, I whispered. He looked at me then, and for the first time I saw something other than fear in his eyes. Now, he said, I do not know what to think. You could have screamed. You could have run. You could have summoned the magistrate and claimed the reward that surely still exists for my capture. £10,000 is a fortune, more than most people will see in a lifetime. You could have bought your freedom from your loveless marriage, your escape from this gilded prison. Instead, you stand here and promise me silence. I do not want your death, I said. I do not want anyone's death, and I do not want money stained with innocent blood. Then you are unlike most of the people in this world, he replied, and there was a bitterness in his voice that cut me to the bone. I have learned not to trust anyone, not to rely on anyone, not to let anyone close enough to betray me. And yet here you are, a duchess, a woman who has everything to lose and nothing to gain, offering me the one thing I have never had since the night my family died. Hope. We stood there for a long moment, the river rushing past, the morning sun beginning to warm the air. I knew that I should leave, that I should return to the house and pretend that this conversation had never happened, but I could not make myself move. What will you do now? I asked. He shook his head. What I have always done. Wait. Watch. Pray that today is not the day they find me, and if they do find you, then I will die, he said simply. as I should have died 20 years ago. "No," I said, and the force of my own voice surprised me. "No, I will not allow it." He looked at me with something like wonder. "You cannot protect me, Your Grace. You do not understand what you would be risking." "I understand," I said. "I understand that you are a man who has committed no crime, who has lost everything, who deserves a chance to live. And I understand that I have spent 5 years in this house, feeling as if I were already dead. Perhaps it is time I remembered what it means to be alive." Those words, spoken impulsively on the banks of a rushing river, would change the course of both our lives. But in that moment, I did not think of consequences. I thought only of the way he looked at me, as if I were the first person in 20 years who had seen him as something other than a target. We returned to the house separately, he to his cottage, I to my chambers, and for the rest of the day I went about my duties as if nothing had happened. But that night, lying alone in my vast and empty bed, I could not stop thinking about him, about Ambrose, about the mark on his chest, the sorrow in his eyes, the impossible burden he had carried alone for so long. I did not know it then, but I had already begun to fall in love with him. The weeks that followed were a study in restraint. I saw Ambrose in the gardens as I always had, and he nodded to me with the same quiet courtesy, and to anyone watching, nothing had changed. But everything had changed. When our eyes met, there was a current of understanding between us, a shared secret that bound us together in ways I could not have anticipated. The world had not shifted on its axis, the sun still rose and set in its accustomed pattern, but for me, everything was different. I moved through my days with a new awareness, a heightened sensitivity to every sight and sound, as if I had been sleepwalking for years and was only now awakening. I found myself seeking excuses to walk past his cottage, to linger near the rose garden where he worked, to exist in his orbit without ever crossing the line that propriety demanded. My morning walks grew longer, my routes more circuitous, my observations of the grounds more detailed than any actual interest in horticulture could justify. The servants must have noticed the change in me, but if they did, they said nothing. Perhaps they attributed it to restlessness, to the boredom of a duchess left too long without society. Perhaps they simply did not care enough to wonder. He began leaving books for me on a stone bench near the fountain, volumes of poetry and philosophy wrapped in plain brown paper. The first time I found one, I thought it must have been left by accident, some servant's forgotten belonging. But when I unwrapped it and saw the title, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, I knew. Only one person at Thornfield would read such a book. Only one person would think to share it with me. I read them in my sitting room by candlelight, tracing the passages he had marked, feeling as if I were conducting a conversation with a man I could never speak to openly. He had underlined sentences about duty and endurance, about finding peace in the midst of chaos, about the importance of accepting what cannot be changed while working to change what can. They were the thoughts of a man who had learned wisdom through suffering, and they spoke to something deep within me. In return, I left him books from the Manor's library, first editions and rare texts that I knew would delight a scholar's heart. I wrapped them carefully in the same plain brown paper, and I placed them on the same stone bench, and the next morning, they were always gone. We never discussed these exchanges. They simply happened, a silent language that belonged only to us. I left him poetry, the verses of Donne and Herbert and Marvell that had brought me comfort in my loneliest hours. I left him novels, the Gothic romances I had devoured as a girl, and the newer works that were just beginning to circulate among the fashionable set. I left him histories and biographies, treatises on art and music and architecture, and with each book I included a small slip of paper on which I had written a few words, never more than a sentence, never anything that could be called a letter. "This passage reminded me of you," I wrote once. Or, "I should like to know your thoughts on this." Or simply, "Thank you." He responded in kind, his handwriting elegant and precise, so different from the labored scrawl one might expect from a gardener. He wrote of ideas that had struck him, of questions that had arisen in his reading, of memories that certain passages had stirred. Never anything personal, never anything that could be considered improper. But through those brief notes, I began to know him in a way that our carefully choreographed encounters in the garden could never have allowed. I learned that he had a philosopher's mind and a poet's heart. I learned that he loved music above all the arts, and that the violin I had heard from his cottage had belonged to his mother. I learned that he dreamed sometimes of the life he might have lived, the throne he might have occupied, the country he might have ruled, and that he woke from those dreams with tears on his face. I learned that he was lonely, desperately and profoundly lonely, and that my small notes had become the brightest part of his days. Cornelius returned to Thornfield in late May, bringing with him a party of political associates who wished to enjoy the countryside air. I played the hostess with practiced ease, arranging dinners and entertainments, smiling at men whose names I forgot as soon as they left the room. My husband treated me with the same distant courtesy he always did, and I was grateful for it. I did not want his attention. I wanted only to be left alone. But one evening, as I was crossing the lawn after a particularly tedious garden party, Cornelius fell into step beside me while his associates walked ahead. "You seem different," he remarked, his tone more curious than concerned. "I do not know what you mean," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He studied me for a moment. "You have color in your cheeks. You seem almost content. If I did not know better, I would say that country life agrees with you." "Perhaps it does," I said, and I smiled in a way I hoped was bland and unremarkable. He seemed satisfied with this answer, and we walked on in silence. But his observation stayed with me, a warning that I could not afford to ignore. If Cornelius could see the change in me, others might see it too. I would have to be more careful. The summer passed in a haze of secret glances and stolen moments. Once, when I was walking in the orchard, Ambrose appeared beside me, as if from nowhere, and we walked together for nearly an hour, speaking of books and music and the shape of the clouds. The orchard was at the far edge of the estate, hidden from the house by a rise in the land, and we could speak freely there without fear of being overheard. He told me about his childhood, about the palace where he had grown up, about his mother's voice and his father's laughter and the sisters he had adored. His voice grew soft when he spoke of them, tinged with a grief that 20 years had not diminished. His mother had been French, he said, a princess from a minor branch of the Bourbon family, and she had brought with her to England a love of art and music and literature that had shaped his entire upbringing. She had taught him to play the violin, sitting beside him for hours as he practiced scales and arpeggios, her patience inexhaustible, her praise the sweetest sound he had ever known. His father had been different, he said, more reserved, more conscious of the demands of kingship. But in private, away from the courtiers and the ministers and the endless parade of supplicants, King Aldrich had been a tender and devoted father. He had taught Ambrose to ride and to hunt, to fence and to shoot, to think strategically and to lead with compassion. He had prepared his son for a throne that would never be claimed, and he had done so with a mixture of duty and love that Ambrose still struggled to reconcile. And his sisters, 3 bright girls with quick minds and kind hearts, who had been his closest companions until the night everything ended. Beatrix, the eldest, who had loved books and despised dancing and had dreamed of traveling to distant lands. Cordelia, the middle sister, who had been the beauty of the family, with hair like spun gold and a laugh that could light up any room. And little Seraphine, the youngest, who had been only 12 when she died, still more child than woman, still believing that the world was a safe and wonderful place. "I killed them," Ambrose said, and his voice was hollow. "I could have warned them. I could have found a way. Instead, I saved myself." "You could not have known," I said. "You did what your father told you to do." "My father told me to survive. He did not tell me to spend the rest of my life wishing I had died with them. I wanted to reach out to him, to take his hand, to offer some comfort that words could not provide. But we were in the open, visible to anyone who might be walking nearby, and I could not take that risk. I could only stand beside him as he wept, silent tears that carved tracks down his weathered face, and wish that I had the power to heal wounds that had been festering for 2 decades. I told him about my own childhood, about my father's debts and my mother's despair and the marriage that had been my only escape. I told him about the years at Thornfield, the loneliness and the silence and the slow erosion of hope. I told him things I had never told anyone, secrets I had kept locked inside me for so long that I had almost forgotten they existed. And he listened with the same attention and compassion that I tried to offer him, and I felt seen in a way I had never felt before. We did not touch. We did not speak of what was growing between us. But when he looked at me, I felt more alive than I had ever felt in my husband's arms. There was a connection between us that transcended the physical, a meeting of minds and hearts that I had never known was possible. It was as if I had been living in a world of shadows, and Ambrose had suddenly opened a door to let in the light. By autumn, I knew that I loved him. The knowledge came not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet certainty, settling into my bones like warmth after a long, cold winter. I loved his mind, his gentleness, the way he spoke of the past with sorrow but without bitterness. I loved the way he listened to me, as if my thoughts mattered, as if I were something more than a decorative addition to a nobleman's estate. I loved the way he seemed to see me, not as a duchess, not as a prize, but as a woman with dreams and fears and desires, a woman who had spent too long being invisible. I do not know when he began to love me in return. Perhaps it was the same day I saw him in the river. Perhaps it was later, during our long walks and whispered conversations. Perhaps it had happened so gradually that neither of us could pinpoint the moment when it began. But by the time the leaves began to fall, painting the grounds of Thornfield in shades of gold and crimson, I could see it in his eyes every time he looked at me, a longing that matched my own. We never spoke of it. To speak of it would be to acknowledge what could never be. I was a married woman, bound by law and duty to a man I did not love. He was a fugitive, hunted by enemies who would stop at nothing to see him dead. Any future between us was impossible as the sun rising in the west or the river flowing backward to its source. And yet, I could not stop dreaming of it. I dreamed of a different world, a world where I had never married Cornelius, where Ambrose had never had to flee for his life, where we could meet openly and love freely without fear of consequences. I dreamed of standing beside him at the altar, of waking in his arms each morning, of growing old together in a cottage by the sea. I dreamed impossible dreams, and I clung to them because they were all I had. The first hint of danger came in late October. A stranger arrived at Thornfield, a man who introduced himself as Mr. Percival Craddock, an antiquarian researching the history of great English estates. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with a sharp face and sharper eyes, and he asked to see the gardens. I did not like him. There was something in the way he looked around, something calculating, that set my nerves on edge. But I could not refuse a scholar's request without raising suspicions, so I assigned one of the footmen to show him the grounds. That evening, I found Ambrose in the shadow of the conservatory, his face pale. "The man who came today," he said. "I know him." "How?" I asked, my heart already beginning to race. "He was one of them," Ambrose replied. "One of the men who attacked the palace that night. He was younger then, just a soldier following orders. But I would know his face anywhere. Do you think he recognized you?" "I do not know. I stayed out of sight as much as I could. But if he is here, it is not by accident. Someone has sent him to look for me." I wanted to take his hand, to offer some comfort, but we were in full view of the house. Instead, I held his gaze and spoke with a certainty I did not feel. "We will find a way," I said. "I will not let them take you." He shook his head. "You do not understand what you are offering. If they discover that you have been hiding me, that you know who I am, your life will be forfeit too." "Then let it be forfeit," I said, and the words came from somewhere deep inside me, from a place I had not known existed until that moment. He looked at me with something like anguish. "Honoria," he said, and it was the first time he had ever used my name. "I love you," I said. "I know it is impossible. I know it is wrong. But I love you, and I will not stand by while they destroy you." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached out and took my hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, warm despite the autumn chill, and the touch sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "I have loved you," he said quietly, "since the day I first saw you walking in the rose garden. I have loved you every moment of every day since, and I have hated myself for it, because I knew that loving you could only bring you pain." "No," I said. "Loving you has brought me back to life." We stood there in the gathering darkness, our hands entwined, and for one perfect moment, the world fell away. There was no Thornfield, no Cornelius, no men hunting through history for a mark on a dead prince's chest. There was only Ambrose and me, and the truth we had finally spoken aloud. But the world, as it always does, returned. Mr. Craddock stayed at the village inn for 3 more days, asking questions of the local merchants and farmers. I had the servants report to me everything he said and did, and what I learned filled me with dread. He was looking for someone, a man of a certain age and description, a man who might have arrived in the area within the last few years, a man who might bear a distinctive scar or mark. On the 3rd night, I made a decision. I could not wait for Craddock to find what he was looking for. I had to act. I went to Ambrose's cottage after dark, cloaked and hooded like a character from one of the novels I had devoured as a girl. He opened the door with surprise on his face, then concern, then something warmer as he drew me inside. "You should not be here," he said. "I know, but I have a plan." I told him what I had learned, and then I told him what I proposed. There was an estate in Scotland, a remote property that had belonged to my mother's family, long abandoned and nearly forgotten. I still had the legal right to it, and I had the means to arrange passage there. If Ambrose could disappear, if we could make it seem as if the gardener called Gideon had simply moved on to another position, then perhaps the trail would go cold. He listened in silence, and when I finished, he shook his head. "I cannot ask you to do this," he said. "You are not asking," I replied. "I am offering. If your husband discovers your involvement, he will ruin you." "My husband does not care enough to ruin me," I said, and the bitterness in my voice surprised us both. "He cares only for his reputation, and as long as I do nothing that threatens it publicly, he will look the other way. He always has." Ambrose stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. "There were so many nights," he said, "when I wished I had died with my family. It seemed easier than living like this, always afraid, always alone." "You are not alone anymore," I said. He turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw the struggle between hope and despair. I also saw love, burning steady and true. "If I go to Scotland," he said slowly, "will you come with me?" The question hung in the air between us. I knew what he was asking. I knew what my answer would mean. If I went with him, I would be abandoning my marriage, my position, everything I had been raised to value. I would be a scandal, a disgrace, a woman who had thrown away respectability for the love of a hunted man. "Yes," I said, "when I can, when I have arranged things so that my absence will not raise immediate suspicion. I will come to you." He crossed the room and took me in his arms, and for the first time, he kissed me. It was a kiss that tasted of longing and sorrow and desperate hope. And when we parted, I knew that I would never belong to anyone else. The days that followed were a blur of secret preparations. I wrote to my cousin, Lady Arabella Croft, who managed the Scottish property, and asked her to open the old house and engage a small staff. I told her that I wished to have a place to retreat to, a sanctuary from the pressures of life at Thornfield. She agreed without asking too many questions, perhaps suspecting more than she said. Meanwhile, Ambrose made his own arrangements. He gave notice to Mrs. Bramwell, claiming that he had received word of an ailing mother in the north and must leave immediately. The housekeeper accepted this with the same careful neutrality she applied to all matters concerning the servants, and within a week, the gardener known as Gideon had packed his meager belongings and departed. Mr. Craddock left the village 2 days later, apparently satisfied that his quarry was not to be found in Derbyshire. I watched his carriage disappear down the road and felt a relief so profound that my knees nearly buckled beneath me. But my relief was premature. Cornelius returned to Thornfield a fortnight later, and this time he was not alone. I was in the drawing room when the carriage arrived, and I rose to greet my husband with the practiced smile I had perfected over years of pretense. But when I saw the man who descended from the carriage behind him, my smile faltered. He was tall and thin, with a face like a blade and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. His name, Cornelius informed me, was Lord Bartholomew Hexworth, and he was the most powerful man in England. Hexworth. The name sent a chill down my spine. The current Earl of Hexworth was the grandson of the man who had led the conspiracy against the Blackwoods. His family had risen to prominence on the bones of the murdered royal family, and they had spent the last 20 years consolidating their power, eliminating any threat to their position, building an empire of influence that stretched from Parliament to the courts to the farthest corners of the realm. If anyone in England was still hunting for Ambrose, it would be the Hexworths. Their legitimacy depended on the complete extinction of the Blackwood line. As long as one heir survived, their claim to power could be challenged. I had heard stories about Lord Bartholomew Hexworth. He was said to be brilliant and ruthless, a man who never forgot a slight and never forgave an enemy. He had served in the foreign wars and had returned with a reputation for cunning that made even his allies uneasy. Some whispered that he had the ear of the king, such as he was, the figurehead monarch who had been installed after the old dynasty fell. Others said that Hexworth was the true power behind the throne, pulling strings from the shadows, eliminating anyone who stood in his way. And now he stood in my drawing room, his thin lips curved in a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your Grace," Lord Hexworth said, taking my hand and pressing his thin lips to my fingers. "What a pleasure to finally meet the Duchess of Thornfield. I have heard so much about you." "The pleasure is mine," I said, and I hoped my voice did not betray the terror I felt. I prayed that my hand was not trembling, that my face was not pale, that nothing in my manner suggested the storm that was raging inside me. Lord Hexworth and his small retinue stayed at Thornfield for 3 days. He was unfailingly polite, charming even, but beneath the courtesy I sensed a predator's patience. He had the manner of a cat watching a mouse hole, content to wait because he knew that eventually, inevitably, his prey would emerge. He asked about the estate, about the staff, about the recent departure of a gardener who had left rather suddenly. I answered with the same bland pleasantness I had learned to employ with Cornelius's other guests, giving nothing away, revealing nothing that could be used against me. But I was under no illusions. Hexworth had not traveled all the way to Derbyshire for the pleasure of the countryside. He was hunting, and I was fairly certain he was hunting for Ambrose. On the second evening, as the gentlemen lingered over their port, and I sat alone in the drawing-room pretending to read, Lord Hexworth appeared in the doorway. "Might I join you, Your Grace?" he asked. I could not refuse. He seated himself across from me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and for a long moment he simply watched me. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they had the flat, assessing quality of a snake's gaze. I felt as if he could see through my skin to the secrets I carried within. "I have been meaning to ask," he said at last, his voice soft and conversational. "Your gardener, the one who left. Did you happen to know him well?" "I employed him," I replied carefully. I was not in the habit of forming close acquaintances with servants. A duchess does not concern herself with the comings and goings of laborers. Of course not. A pause, during which he continued to watch me with those unnerving eyes. "Only I have heard that he was something of an unusual man. Well-read, cultured, quite unlike the typical laborer. Several of the villagers remarked upon it. They said he spoke like a gentleman and carried himself like one too. I would not know. I rarely spoke to him beyond the most basic pleasantries." Lord Hexworth smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "How curious. Several of your servants mentioned that you took a particular interest in the grounds. They said you walked there every morning, often near where this man worked. They said you sometimes stopped to observe his labors, even to exchange a few words." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I forced myself to meet his gaze without flinching. "I enjoy walking," I said. "It is good for the constitution. And I take an interest in all aspects of my household, including the gardens. There is nothing unusual in that. Indeed, there is not." He leaned forward slightly, and I could smell the port on his breath, sweet and cloying. "But harboring a fugitive is unusual. Aiding a pretender to the crown is unusual. These are crimes of the highest order, Your Grace, punishable by death." "I do not know what you are talking about," I said, and I met his gaze without flinching. He studied me for a long moment, and then he laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed off the walls of the drawing room. "Of course you do not. Forgive me. I have been chasing ghosts for so long that I see them everywhere. The Blackwood heir has been dead for 20 years, and I am a fool to imagine otherwise." He rose and bowed and left me alone in the drawing room, and I sat there with my heart pounding until I heard his footsteps fade away. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to clasp them together in my lap to still them, and for a long time I could not move, could not think, could not do anything but breathe and thank God that Ambrose was already far away. That night I wrote a letter to Ambrose, warning him of Hexworth's visit. I could not send it through the normal post. The risk was too great. Instead, I entrusted it to Molly, the scullery maid, whose sister lived in a village on the road to Scotland. She was a simple girl, loyal and discreet, and she asked no questions when I pressed a coin into her hand and asked her to see the letter delivered. Lord Hexworth departed the following morning, but before he left, he took my hand once more and held it a moment longer than was proper. "I shall be watching, Your Grace," he said quietly. "I always find what I am looking for." I said nothing. I simply smiled and waved as his carriage disappeared down the drive, and then I went to my room and wept. The winter that followed was the longest of my life. I received only one letter from Ambrose, delivered by a method so circuitous that it took nearly 2 months to reach me. He was safe, he wrote. The Scottish property was remote and well concealed. He had grown a beard and adopted yet another name, and no one in the village suspected that the quiet gentleman who had taken up residence in the old manor was anything other than what he appeared to be. He wrote of his loneliness, of the long nights when he stared into the fire and thought of me. He wrote of his hope that we would be together soon, that the danger would pass and we would find a way to build a life beyond the reach of those who hunted him. He wrote of his love, a love that had sustained him through 20 years of exile and would sustain him through whatever was to come. I read that letter so many times that I knew every word by heart. I carried it with me always, hidden in a secret pocket of my petticoat, close to my skin. It was my talisman, my proof that what we shared was real. Spring came, and with it, news that shook the foundations of my world. Cornelius had suffered an attack of apoplexy while attending a session of Parliament. He had collapsed in the lobby of the House of Lords and been carried home to the townhouse, where he lay for 3 weeks, hovering between life and death. I went to London immediately. It was expected of me, and despite everything, I did not wish my husband ill. I sat by his bedside as the doctors bled him and purged him and did all the terrible things that doctors did in those days. And I held his hand when he woke, confused and frightened, to ask where he was. He recovered, slowly, but he was not the same man. The apoplexy had left him weakened, both in body and in mind. He could no longer manage his political affairs, could barely manage the affairs of his own household. The doctors recommended rest, quiet, country air, and so, in the early summer, we returned to Thornfield. I should have been relieved. Cornelius was too ill to question my movements, too preoccupied with his own recovery to notice if I seemed distracted or distant. I had more freedom than I had ever had before, and I should have used it to plan my escape, to make arrangements for my departure to Scotland. But instead, I found myself trapped. The household was in chaos. Servants who had run things smoothly in my absence were now looking to me for guidance. Cornelius required constant attention. Nurses and doctors and visitors who came to pay their respects. I was besieged by responsibilities, and every day that passed was another day that I could not go to Ambrose. And then, one morning in July, Lord Hexworth returned. He came with a magistrate and a company of soldiers, and when I saw them riding up the drive, I knew that everything was lost. They searched the house from top to bottom, looking for evidence of my complicity. They questioned the servants, threatened them, offered bribes. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. I had been too careful. But Hexworth was not satisfied. He came to me in the drawing room, where I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and he told me what he intended to do. "We have tracked your fugitive to Scotland," he said. "My men are on their way there now. By the time the sun sets tomorrow, Ambrose Blackwood will be in custody." "You have no proof," I said. "We have the mark on his chest," he replied. "That is all the proof we need." I thought of Ambrose, alone in the old manor house, unaware of the danger riding toward him. I thought of the life we had planned, the future that was slipping away even as I sat there, and I made a decision. "What would you take?" I asked, "in exchange for his life?" Hexworth's eyebrows rose, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw genuine surprise on his face. "What are you offering, Your Grace?" "Everything," I said. "The estate, the fortune, my silence, my cooperation. Whatever you want. I will give you anything, sign anything, do anything if you will spare his life." He considered this for a long moment, his pale eyes studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away. I forced myself to hold his gaze, to show no weakness, to let him see the depth of my determination. "You would give up everything," he said slowly. "Your title, your wealth, your position in society. You would become a nobody, a woman without name or fortune, all for the sake of a fugitive you barely know." "I know him," I said. "I know him better than I have ever known anyone. And I love him. Is that not enough?" Hexworth was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its coldness. "I have hunted Ambrose Blackwood for 20 years, he said. "My grandfather began the hunt, and my father continued it. And now the task has fallen to me. The Hexworth legacy depends on the complete extinction of the Blackwood line. As long as one heir survives, our claim to power can be challenged. Do you understand what you are asking me to give up?" "I understand," I said. "But I also understand that Ambrose has no interest in challenging your claim. He has spent 20 years hiding, running, trying only to survive. He does not want the throne, He does not want revenge. He wants only to live out his days in peace. And you believe that? I know it, I said. I know him. He is tired of running, tired of fear, tired of being alone. All he wants is a quiet life, far from courts and politics and the games that men like you play. If you let him go, he will disappear. You will never hear from him again. Is that not worth more to you than the satisfaction of seeing him dead? Hexworth rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds where Ambrose had once worked. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of decisions that would shape the rest of our lives. And if I were to take you up on this offer, he said at last, what guarantee would I have that you would keep your word? What assurance that you would not betray me the moment I turned my back? I will sign whatever documents you require, I said. I will surrender whatever legal rights you demand. I will become a ghost, if that is what it takes. I will leave England and never return, take a new name, live out my days in obscurity, and I will ensure that Ambrose does the same. We will vanish so completely that it will be as if we never existed. Hexworth turned to look at me, and something in his expression had shifted. The cold calculation was still there, but beneath it, I thought I saw something else. Respect, perhaps, or simply curiosity. You truly love him, do you not? He asked. More than my own life, I said. He nodded slowly. Very well, Your Grace. I believe we can come to an arrangement. The documents were drawn up that same day. I signed away my dowry, my widow's portion, everything I had ever been promised. I agreed to leave England and never return, to take a new name and live out my days in obscurity. In exchange, Hexworth would call off his men and allow Ambrose to escape. It was a devil's bargain, and I knew it. But I would have sold my soul 1,000 times over to save the man I loved. The soldiers departed that evening. Their orders changed. Hexworth left the following morning, taking the signed documents with him. And I, Honoria Ashworth, Duchess of Thornfield, began the process of disappearing. It took nearly a year to arrange everything. Cornelius died in the autumn, his heart finally giving out after months of decline. I wore mourning, attended his funeral, settled his affairs. His heir, a distant cousin, took possession of Thornfield, and I was free. I traveled first to France, where I had made arrangements through a network of sympathetic friends. From France, I went to Italy, then to Switzerland, then finally, by a route so convoluted that even I sometimes forgot where I had been, back to Scotland. He was waiting for me at the old manor house, thinner than I remembered, grayer at the temples, but with the same storm-cloud eyes that had captured my heart all those years ago. When he saw me coming up the drive, he ran to meet me, and when he took me in his arms, I knew that I was finally home. We married in a small church in the village, with no guests and no witnesses save the minister and his wife. We took new names, ordinary names, names that would attract no attention. And we began a life that neither of us had ever dared to dream we would have. There were still dangers. There would always be dangers. Hexworth's agreement was contingent on our silence, on our invisibility, and we lived always with the knowledge that discovery could mean death. But we had each other, and that was enough. In the years that followed, we built something beautiful from the ruins of our former lives. Ambrose taught himself to be a farmer, working the land with the same quiet intensity he had once brought to the gardens of Thornfield. I learned to cook and clean and keep house, skills I had never needed as a duchess, but which gave me more satisfaction than any embroidery had ever done. We read books by the fire on winter evenings. We walked together in the hills on summer mornings. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, making up for all the years of silence. And sometimes, late at night, Ambrose would tell me about his family, about his father, the king, who had taught him to ride and to fight and to think for himself. About his mother, the queen, who had sung lullabies in French and smelled of lavender and always known how to make him laugh. About his sisters, 3 bright girls with quick minds and kind hearts, who had been his closest companions until the night everything ended. He wept when he spoke of them, and I held him, and I wept too. Their deaths would never stop hurting. Their loss would never be filled. But together, we found a way to carry the weight of the past without being crushed by it. We grew old together, Ambrose and I. The years softened us, gentled us, turned our hair white and our steps slow. The world outside changed and changed again, empires rising and falling, wars fought and won and lost. But in our little corner of Scotland, time moved differently. We were forgotten, just as we had wanted to be, and in that forgetting, we found peace. Ambrose died on a spring morning, with the sun streaming through the windows and the sound of birdsong in the air. He was in my arms when he took his last breath, and his final word was my name. I buried him in the churchyard where we had been married, beneath a stone that bore only the name he had chosen and the dates of the life we had shared. No one would ever know that the quiet farmer who rested there was the last of the Blackwood kings, the prince who should have ruled an empire. But I knew, and that was enough. I am old now, older than I ever expected to be, and my time grows short. But before I go, I wanted to tell our story, to set it down so that someone, someday, would know the truth. Not the truth of kings and conspiracies, of politics and power. The truth of two people who found each other against all odds, who loved each other despite all obstacles, who built a life together that was more precious than any crown. I saw him rise from the river like a ghost returning from the dead, and in that moment, everything changed. But if I could go back, knowing what I know now, knowing all the pain and fear and sacrifice that lay ahead, I would not change a single thing. Because loving him was the greatest adventure of my life, and being loved by him was the greatest gift I ever received. The candle is burning low, and my hand grows tired. But my heart is full, and when I close my eyes, I can see him waiting for me, just beyond the veil, ready to take my hand and walk with me into whatever comes next. I am Honoria, and I was loved. That is enough. That is everything. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and I find myself thinking of all the sunsets we watched together, all the quiet evenings when we sat on the porch of our little house and said nothing at all because there was no need for words. He would take my hand, and I would rest my head on his shoulder, and the world would fall away until there was nothing left but the two of us and the dying light. I miss him still, with an ache that time has softened but never healed. Some nights, I wake and reach for him, and the emptiness beside me is a wound that will never close. But then I remember his face, his voice, the way he looked at me as if I were the only thing in the world that mattered, and the pain becomes bearable. Because he loved me. Because we had those years together. Because against all odds, we found our way to each other. The story I have told you is true, every word of it. I have changed nothing, embellished nothing, hidden nothing. It is the story of my life, and now that it is written, I feel a peace I have not known since the day he died. There are so many things I could say, so many lessons I could draw from the journey we took together. I could tell you that love is worth any sacrifice, any risk, any pain. I could tell you that the heart knows truths the mind cannot comprehend. I could tell you that redemption is always possible, that even the darkest night gives way to dawn, that hope is the one thing no one can take from you unless you let them. All of these things are true, but they are also too small, too neat, too easily summarized. The truth of a life cannot be contained in aphorisms. It can only be lived day by day, breath by breath, until the story reaches its end. My end is coming. I can feel it in my bones, in the way my breath catches, in the way the world seems to shimmer at the edges like a dream about to dissolve. But I am not afraid. I have known fear, known it intimately, and I have learned that it is not the enemy we believe it to be. Fear is simply a sign that something matters, that there is something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. And I have had so much to protect, so much to fight for. He gave me that. Ambrose. The man who should have been king and instead became a gardener, a farmer, a husband. He gave me a reason to live, a reason to love, a reason to hope, and in return, I gave him the only thing I had to give, myself, wholly and completely, without reservation or regret. We did not have children. It was a sorrow we carried together, a door that remained forever closed. But we had each other, and we had the life we built, and perhaps that was its own kind of family. A family of two, bound not by blood, but by choice, by commitment, by the kind of love that survives even death. I think of my parents sometimes, of the world I left behind when I fled England, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart full of forbidden love. My mother died the year after I left, and I did not learn of it until months later, through a letter that had been forwarded through a dozen different hands. My sister Philippa married a clergyman and lived a quiet life in the village where we had grown up. She never knew what became of me. I hope she was happy. I hope she found the peace that I found, though by a different road. And Thornfield? I have heard nothing of it in decades. Perhaps it still stands. That great sprawling house with its endless gardens and its portraits of disapproving ancestors. Perhaps it has crumbled into ruin, claimed by time and weather, and the relentless march of years. It does not matter. It was never really my home. My home was wherever Ambrose was, and now my home is in my memories of him. The pen grows heavy in my hand, and the pages before me are nearly full. I have said what I came to say. I have told the story that demanded to be told, and now there is only the waiting. The village priest came to see me yesterday. He is a kind man, young and earnest, with no idea of who I really am or what I have lived through. He spoke of heaven and salvation, of the peace that awaits the faithful, and I listened and nodded and said the things that were expected of me. But in my heart, I was thinking of Ambrose, of the moment when I will see him again, of the words I will say and the embrace that will never end. I do not know if there is a heaven. I do not know if the soul survives the death of the body, or if we simply return to the darkness from which we came. But I know this. If there is any justice in the universe, any love at the heart of creation, then Ambrose is waiting for me somewhere beyond the veil. And when I cross over, he will be there, and we will walk together into whatever comes next. This is my testament. This is my confession. This is the story of Honoria Ashworth, once a duchess, once a fugitive, once a wife, always a woman in love. I hope that whoever reads these words will understand. I hope they will not judge me too harshly for the choices I made, the rules I broke, the life I left behind. I did what I did for love, and I would do it all again. The candle has burned down to a stub, and the night is growing dark. Soon, the servant will come to help me to my bed, and I will close my eyes and dream of him, as I have dreamed every night for years. And perhaps, one of these nights, I will not wake up, and the dream will become real, and I will be with him again. Until then, I wait. Until then, I remember. Until then, I love. Goodbye, reader. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you find your Ambrose. I hope you find your love. I hope you live a story worth telling. I did, and I am grateful. The mark on his chest was not a curse. It was a gift. It was the sign that led me to him, the proof that he was real, the beginning of everything that mattered. I saw him rise from the river like a ghost returning from the dead. And I loved him. God help me, I loved him with everything I had. And that love saved us both. The end of one story is always the beginning of another. I know that now. I know that the tale I have told will live on after I am gone, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, a small flame in the darkness that might, if it is lucky, light the way for someone else. But my part is done. My story is complete. And so, With a heart full of love and a soul at peace, I set down my pen and prepare to meet whatever awaits me. Ambrose, my darling, I am coming home. The winter rains have stopped at last, and through my window I can see the first pale light of dawn creeping over the hills. It reminds me of that morning by the river, when I stumbled upon the secret that would change my life forever. The water was cold that day, rushing over the rocks with a sound like whispered secrets, and the man who rose from its depths was like nothing I had ever seen. I was afraid at first, afraid of what I had discovered, afraid of what it might mean, afraid of the feelings that stirred in my heart when I looked at him. Fear is a strange companion. It can paralyze you, trap you in a cage of your own making, or it can set you free, pushing you toward choices you never knew you had the courage to make. My fear pushed me toward courage. My fear led me to love. I have thought often over the years about what might have happened if I had never taken that walk by the river. If I had stayed on the familiar paths, the safe paths, the paths that propriety and duty demanded. I would have lived out my days at Thornfield, a dutiful duchess, a lonely woman, a ghost haunting my own life. I would never have known what it felt like to be truly seen, truly loved, truly alive. And Ambrose? He would have remained in hiding, a man without a name, a prince without a kingdom, slowly fading into the shadows until there was nothing left of him but a memory and a mark on his chest. He would have died alone, unknown, unmourned. But I did take that walk, and I did see him, and everything changed. There is a lesson in this, I think, a lesson about fate and choice, about the paths we take and the paths we leave untaken. We cannot control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. We can choose to hide from the unexpected, or we can choose to embrace it. We can choose to let fear rule us, or we can choose to let love guide us. I chose love, and it made all the difference. The servants think I am writing letters. They bring me tea and biscuits and ask if I need anything, and I smile and shake my head, and they leave me alone with my papers. They are good people, kind people, but they do not know me. They see an old woman living out her final days in quiet obscurity, and they treat me with the gentle respect one shows to the elderly. They do not know that I was once a duchess. They do not know that I once gave up everything for a fugitive prince. They do not know that the quiet life I have lived in this remote corner of Scotland was built on secrets and sacrifices they cannot imagine. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the greatest stories are the ones that are never told, the ones that live only in the hearts of those who live them. Perhaps my story will die with me, these pages moldering in a chest until someone finds them decades hence and wonders who Honoria was and why she wrote so many words about a gardener and a river. Or perhaps not. Perhaps you, whoever you are, have found these pages and read them and understood. Perhaps my words have reached across the years and touched something in you, stirred something, awakened something. Perhaps my story has become part of yours. I like to think so. I like to think that love, real love, has a way of echoing through time, passing from generation to generation like a flame that cannot be extinguished. I like to think that Ambrose and I, in our small and secret way, have added to that flame, have made the world a little brighter, a little warmer, a little more alive. But these are the thoughts of an old woman, sentimental and soft. The young Honoria, the Duchess who walked the gardens of Thornfield with her heart locked away, would have scoffed at such notions. She believed in duty, in propriety, in the cold calculus of social position and material advantage. She did not believe in love. I am glad she was wrong. The bells of the village church are ringing. It is Sunday, I realize, and soon the streets will fill with people making their way to worship. I will not join them. My legs are too weak for the walk, and besides, I have never been much for formal religion. My faith, such as it is, was forged in the years I spent with Ambrose, in the quiet miracles of every ordinary day we shared. I believe in the love that brought us together. I believe in the courage that kept us together. I believe in the grace that allowed us to find each other in a world determined to keep us apart. If there is a God, I think He understands. I think He forgives my unorthodoxy, my failures, my sins. I think He looks at my heart and sees not a duchess who abandoned her duty, not a woman who broke her marriage vows, but a soul who loved with everything she had. And if there is no God, then the love I shared with Ambrose was its own kind of heaven, and I am content. The fire is burning low. I should call the servant to add more coal, but I find that I do not want to break the silence. The quiet is soothing, a balm for the restlessness that has plagued me these last few weeks. I know what it means, this restlessness. I know that my body is preparing for its final journey, loosening its hold on the world, making ready for whatever comes next. I am not afraid. I have lived a full life, a rich life, a life that exceeded every expectation I had for myself. I have loved and been loved. I have lost and found and lost again. I have known joy and sorrow, hope and despair, fear and courage. I have been a duchess and a fugitive, a wife and a widow, a young woman full of dreams and an old woman full of memories. What more could anyone ask? The light is fading now. The first stars are appearing in the sky, faint pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. I used to watch the stars with Ambrose, lying on our backs in the meadow behind the house, trying to name the constellations. He knew them all, of course. His tutors had taught him astronomy, along with Latin and Greek and philosophy and all the other subjects befitting a prince. I knew only a few, the ones my governess had pointed out on clear nights when I was young. But I loved to listen to him talk, loved to hear the enthusiasm in his voice, the joy he took in sharing what he knew. Those nights under the stars were some of the happiest of my life. No servants to wait on us, no society to please, no expectations to fulfill, just the two of us and the infinite sky and the love that needed no words to express itself. I close my eyes and I am there again. The grass cool beneath my back, his hand warm in mine, his voice a gentle murmur in the darkness. That one is Cassiopeia, he is saying. Do you see? The 5 stars that form a W? I see, I whisper, though in truth I am not looking at the stars. I am looking at him, at the profile I have come to know better than my own, at the face I love more than life itself. And there, he continues, pointing, Orion, the hunter. My father used to tell me stories about him. Tell me, I say. And he does. He tells me tales of gods and heroes, of monsters slain and maidens rescued, of a time when the world was young and everything was possible. His voice rises and falls in the darkness, weaving magic from words, and I listen with my whole heart. These are the memories I will carry with me into the dark. These are the treasures no one can take from me. These are the proof that I lived,